Thanks for joining us today. We've got Alan Giles on the call with us. He's going to be running through his presentation on testing job specs like app specs. He's going to give us his tips to hire or get hired using software testing techniques. There'll be time for questions at the end, so if you can keep those until then, or just pop them in the Zoom chat function at the bottom of your screen, and then we can come around to those at the end. But Alan, over to you.
Okay, thanks. So, hi everybody. This is the little talk I've prepared about testing job specs like app specs. So the idea being that actually they're not at all that different, and if you know how to do one, then you pretty much know how to do the other. So we're going to go through some tips and some observations I've made on how to hire or to get hired using software testing techniques. So first, about me, why would you want to listen to me about this topic? So I've been an interviewee since way back, it makes me feel old, since '95. So all sorts of interviews back from when I was doing school work experience up to today. And I've been in easily 100 interviews on that side of the desk. I've also been an interviewer since 2007, a bit more recently. And I've interviewed well over 100 times since then. So I think they're good enough numbers to get an idea of what's going on. I've had jobs and interviews in shops, schools, factories, outdoors, and naturally in offices, of which in the software industry I've been for the last 15 years, all in London, and in quality and test for the last 10. The companies have been large and small, some techie, some not. And I'm currently a QA lead at Zesty, and we are a healthcare provider providing digital solutions to the healthcare industry. And before you ask, no, I'm not currently hiring. And also, I'm not currently looking for work, in case you're also wondering that. So what have we got coming up? So I'd like to start with the inspiration for today's talk, why I wanted to express my kind of proposal. I'll go through how I used my QA skills to get to this point. If you're still not convinced, then I'll go through some more detail. And also we'll ask, so what? It's something you should always ask naturally when you're conducting software testing or generally in life, and wonder about the purpose. Is there a purpose to what we're doing? So I'll go through the purpose of the process. That's the hiring and being hired and software testing and QA process, which throughout I'll be using them kind of interchangeably. So if you notice that I kind of flip between them, then that's kind of deliberate. The idea being that they're not that different enough to actually specify be specific. We'll go through what it means to look at a spec, whether it's a job spec or a feature spec or app spec. We'll go through the interview stage, which is in effect the test execution stage. No QA talk would be complete without a quick mention of the manual versus auto world and how that has what that means in terms of the hiring process. And we'll also look at context, because that's something you should always look at when you're testing something and also when you're hiring or being hired. Then we'll do a quick recap, and then we'll go through some questions and any of your observations at the end. So what's the inspiration for today's talk? Well, something that I find, what's the right word? Difficult to handle from my kind of methodical philosophy that I've got is the let's see how it goes approach. So whether that means when you're approaching the software delivery lifecycle, or whether that means you're trying to hire someone, or whether you're trying to get a job, the let's see it goes attitude, basically not having a plan and just winging it, is what's kind of triggered my talk today. So what does that mean? That means you don't have a particular plan. There's not any particular structure, and there's not really any consistency in what you do. So if you were to interview somebody today and then in a week, the structure and the content and the manner of it would be differing so much that you could actually interview the same person twice in 2 weeks and get a different result. So what's wrong with that? Well, that's pretty risky, I'd say. And being in the software testing sphere, I'm pretty risk averse, and I'm not really into that idea of flipping a coin. It makes me kind of feel a bit like this. If that's going to run, it's not going to run. Okay, test failed. That is Wile E. Coyote's attitude to life, let's put it. So what else is the let's see it goes attitude all about? Well, in the end, it means there's no fairness. You're not, in a scientific sense, you're not conducting a fair test. If you can't reproduce what you just did and you can't explain to others how to do it, then you're not going to get the same result. And so you can't really trust that result. It means the results are inconsistent, and obviously they pose a risk. What do you get? You get false negatives in that case. You get things failing where actually they shouldn't be. So what does that mean in terms of impact? Well, that's a missed opportunity. It means you're not achieving what you may want to achieve. In the case of job hunting, that means you'll miss out on a job you want. And in the software testing world, it means you waste a lot of time trying to verify whether a failed test is genuine or not. But actually much worse than that are the false positives. So what this means is that all the tests pass, but actually they shouldn't do. And that's a far worse impact than any other in my kind of viewpoint. So from the employer's point of view, it means if you get somebody in who doesn't match what you think they were or weren't as good as you thought they were going to be in that particular role, obviously there's a loss of productivity because they're not doing what they're supposed to. There's the impact on team morale. There's the wasted time that you're going to spend on issues related to that. The value of the entire team could be affected, and in the worst cases, obviously there could be the cost and time of litigation. For the employee, it's the same state. So if you're in a role that didn't turn out to be what you thought it was, there's the stress element, which affects your mental health. Obviously, if you don't know if you're going to keep your job, that's financial instability. And again, it can also lead to litigation. So how do we reduce that risk? So using my QA skills that I'd learned through testing software, plus also interviewing, well, I started to spot patterns. There's a lot of things that you can notice that keep repeating themselves. You actually have the concept of expected versus actual behavior. You have the idea of what something ought to be and what it ends up being. Also, it allows you to make predictions if you do that. And ultimately, ideally, you're catching the issues before they happen. So preventing any false positives or false negatives. And it led me to realize that hiring people, getting a job, and testing software are, in effect, the same process. So if you're still not convinced, let's have a look at some more detail. There's the requirements element. So when you're asked to put an app through a QA process, then you base what you're doing on a requirement, whatever that happens to be. And in the job hunting sphere, that means that you have a requirement as a job applicant, and the employer, the hiring manager, also has a requirement of what they expect. Now that's usually, not always, conducted in a written spec, could be informal and just spoken, and it's often not written by the product owner. It's in the software sphere, it's written by a BA often, or someone else, and in the job hunting world, it's often written by a recruiter or HR, and you have to take that into account when approaching that particular spec. They all have a success criteria concept with a formal sign-off, so whether that be by a product owner or by an HR contract. They can be broken down into acceptance criteria, which can be individually accepted or rejected. There are agent roles. Often there's in software, so there's often a user or an admin kind of role concept. And in the job hunting sphere, there's obviously the employer and applicant and other roles like a recruiter. They can be a formal or an informal process. Things could be done on the fly, or they could be done very regimentally. And they all have their risks during their process, and they have ways of mitigating that risk. And how do you mitigate the risk? Well, generally by testing. And that test process in the job hunting world is basically interviewing. And you always have to look at the context. So in a given context, in an environment, at a particular point in time, how does this impact whether you meet the success criteria or not? There are always people issues, whether in technology or in hiring, and there's always a bigger picture involved. The economy, the organization structure at the time, you know, anything can impact what the result is. So what? So yeah, okay, so I found some kind of similarity between the two. Well, you can probably make analogies of pretty much anything you want. Is there any point to it? So how you perceive or visualize a process can actually help how you're going to approach it, and can also impact how it goes, because perception on all sides leads to behavior. How you expect a particular situation to go can affect how it actually goes. So, for example, when I was approaching this talk today, I could have visualized myself, poor naked me, surrounded by all you hungry lions. However, I preferred to look at it as that all of you are lovely fluffy kittens, and that you're just going to be nicely purring at me on mute. Why did that help? Well, actually a lot of people can get nervous. It affects your performance, and it creates obstacles in your flow. So what else? Is there any other reason for thinking it that way? Well, if you're actually good at testing software, then probably you're pretty good at hiring, or you're pretty good at being hired, if they mean the same thing. If you can naturally think like a user without actually being an end user, then you can probably think like an interviewer, and you can think like an interviewee. It helps by doing so, you're more objective. You can still be passionate about what you do, but at the same time, it's less personal, because you're taking on a role, if that's how you view it, rather than it's being personally you. And in doing so, hopefully you'll have less anxiety about the issue. Lots of people can freak out when there's a software release about to happen in prod, especially if it's been months in the prep. But I don't think many people have the anxiety level that they do when they go to interviews. For example, I've had cases of people sweating so profusely that they actually soak themselves and sit wet. And that just stops the flow, in the sense of that person may be good, maybe not, but I'll never know, because they crumbled at the interview. Another thing I feel strongly about is cross-training. So it's a very effective way of improving your craft is look at other areas other industries, other disciplines, and understand if something works in that, probably it will in your sphere too. It means you can harness your strengths to gain some advantages, because obviously it's a competitive world, and you'll take more opportunities and you'll build confidence. And confidence is what we'll be talking about as part of the process. So one of the purposes of the hiring and software testing process is confidence. No app, candidate, or role is 100% accurate or successful. Everything has defects, but if anyone asks, you should obviously say you don't have any P1s. You've only got a little minor cosmetic set faults. The hiring QA process provides a level of confidence. It gives the perception to whoever's signing off whether they should go ahead or not, and it makes a decision easier to make. So if you project and inspire confidence, you're far more likely to meet the success criteria. What's another purpose of the process? Well, it's also about verifying. Does the thing do what it actually claims to be able to do? If you have an app that says it can track your cycling route in a forest, can it do so if you actually go in a forest and test it? If a candidate says that they know Java like a developer, do they actually know that? And testing, interviewing is part of that process. Does the reality match the claim or the plan? But be very careful. Be very careful with how you play that confidence. The video is not going to run now, I think. But this chap here is Charles Martin. He a few years ago was in a world championship bout with Anthony Joshua, and he came out with the phrase, "I'll walk this earth like a god, and I'll step right over you," into Anthony Joshua's face prior to the fight. In the actual fight, he got knocked down on the floor, and the commentator said, "Look at him. He can clearly look across and he's thinking, what on earth was that?" And if that's the case, for him, it can also be the case when you release something to prod and something unexpected happens, and the same if you turn up to an interview and things are not what you expect. So let's have a look at the idea of a spec. So what's a spec all about? Well, if you want to test a spec, you need to review it and you need to do some static testing. So have a look at it. Is the requirement clear? That's the important part. Does it have requirements specified? And if they do, what exactly are they? And again, naturally, a software tester will look at a spec and take on the role of a user and attack it in terms of what that would mean if they were the end user. And using this approach, you can also think like the employer and think like the applicant. If you read this spec, does it actually make sense? Is it clear what you want? Are there acceptance criteria? Do you have ridiculous expectations like 0 defects? Are there things in priority order? So things like attend meetings being high up the list. Well, in effect, that's a very passive activity, which actually would be difficult to imagine anyone cannot do. How would you fail that? And obviously it's cosmetic, as in you just sit. Is it realistic? Do they put things like they want 20 years of testing experience of all sorts of apps? They want you to be able to automate anything you see on the fly, plus that you've got management experience, plus you need to have domain knowledge, plus you need to have security clearance, plus all these things. How realistic is the expectation? And if it's unrealistic, it should give you doubts whether that's actually, whether you match what the expectation is. Also, a big bugbear of mine is consistency. Is it actually consistent throughout? Does the start of the document actually match the end of it? If it says at the top, coding is desirable, and then at the bottom it says, must be able to set up automation frameworks from scratch, that's, again, highly doubtful what's going on there. And then Are there any non-functional requirements included in that? And in the job hunting sphere, that more or less means soft skills like able to work in isolation or able to lead a team or working remotely or any of these kind of things. So there's something else to consider when you look at it. But the most important thing is what's being provided matching what's expected? So when it says in the spec what's required, is what you're delivering going to match that? Not whether it's good or bad, but whether it matches. And that's the kind of point of the hiring process. Is you have a CV which is in effect your spec, and the job, whether that matches the job spec. The interview on both sides, both cases, both parties need to match the expectations and actual results. And then what happens for real in live when you're actually doing the job, or whether the app is running in live, does it meet the expectations that were at the very beginning? And the first two steps of that process are really trying to replicate the third, which we'll come on to later. So in terms of interview, it's all about the planning, the preparation, and the execution. The general principle should be that you should always avoid doing something for the first time in prod. So if you treat an interview as prod testing, or you imagine it so, as test execution, are you going to be going through that process for the first time in your head when you're actually sitting in the chair in the interview? If so, I'd highly recommend against that. I wouldn't let the interviewer be the first person who asks you a particular question, and I wouldn't let the candidate be the first person who hears that question if you're an interviewer. I would highly recommend that you practice in advance with friends or relatives or colleagues, and if you have the opportunity in the workplace, to actually volunteer for some interviews. You need to prepare the data, whether that be about your past experiences, to give examples of your achievements, or even negative situations, how you handled difficult situations. And always prepare some anecdotes. It's always better to tell a story. It's always better to give a full-on scenario rather than a one-word answer. And this matters more for the interviewer, but there should be some kind of logical structure. There's no point going through a 5-stage process and then at the end look at someone's CV and say they don't have a particular qualification and then fail them on that. It doesn't make sense that you do that at the end. You have to do that at the beginning, and that logical structure should be throughout. And in the sense of an interviewee in that situation, you should try to structure your stories with a start, a middle, and an end. And then the most important thing is obviously clarity. You always should say what you mean and mean what you say, as the phrase goes. Now, going back to the thing about anxiety earlier, so of course the important thing is not to panic. But of course it's okay to be nervous, and you need to turn that around to make that nervous energy positive. So I was obviously, I've done quite a few of these talks, but I was nervous today approaching this talk, but I'm trying to turn it into a more positive energy and keep myself focused on the success criteria. What else is there in an interview? So going back to the idea of taking the role of a user. So testers, they naturally attack a problem thinking, if I was the user, I would do this. If I wouldn't like this, I would expect that. And if you do that when preparing for an interview, it actually makes the entire process a lot easier. So for interviewees, that means, as I said earlier, try interviewing, practice in front of the mirror, record it on your laptop, do it with friends and family or in the workplace if you can. Same for interviewers, to be honest. I know quite a few interviewers who have, because of their seniority generally, haven't been interviewed probably for 10 years. And then it's obvious when they deliver their interview that they've actually forgotten what it means to be on the other side. So always try to think about what it's like on the other side of the desk. In doing so, you'll develop empathetic thinking and use emotional intelligence, which are excellent properties of developing your craft, whether that be testing or hiring. And also we'll go back to the idea of purpose. So there has to be a point to what you're doing. Countless times I've heard or experienced questions like, where do you see yourself in a number of years? What's your biggest strength, weakness? If you're an animal or a dinosaur, which one would you be? And while they might be fun to ask some of these kind of things, is there actually a point to the answer? If you ask 10 people and they give the same answer, would you react to them in the same way? You have to wonder whether you're just filling time or asking what you think you're supposed to ask, rather than actually having a purpose to what you're doing. And in the test world, that reflects on things like, if you've got an 8-digit password to test and you put in 4 5s or 5 5s and 6 5s, you could go on doing that all day, but what will it actually tell you if you do so? Oh, well, I'll take a 4 off and put a 5 on. Okay, I'll take a 3 off and put a 6 on. In doing so, you're looking like you're doing lots of test cases, but is there any value in what you're doing? So I would always ask the question, so what's the purpose of this? Is there actually an intention of, is there a way of failing this particular criteria, this question, this test? And what would happen if somebody passed or failed it? Would it actually matter? A QA mentor of mine told me a while back that you should always question. As QA, you should always question what's going on. Never trust it, never assume, always ask. So let's go back to the idea of replicating live. So the hiring process is often described as artificial, as superficial, as in you might be really good at a job, but really rubbish at interviews, or vice versa. And so it's not really fair that somebody has to go through that process if they're not very good at it, when they could do the job. However, the same applies to the testing sphere as well. If the test environments are not reflective of live, then you'll spend a lot of time saying, well, that's just because it's in test. That breaks, or that isn't realistic. And you get, if you raise a bug and it gets rejected because of the environment, well, that ought to question whether the environments are good enough for the purpose. Are they fit for what they're supposed to do? So the other thing to consider is, without actually testing in prod, in live, you don't actually know for sure whether that thing is fit for purpose or not. So whether that be a probation or a trial period in the job hunted sphere, or whether it's A/B testing or whatever in live, in the software testing sphere, you don't really know for sure if you're doing it pre-prod, whether that's actually reflecting what it's going to be when it really happens for real. But then, are you ever really sure? The whole process is about providing confidence and assurance and mitigating the risks, rather than aiming for 100% perfection. And in the end, what that means is, the most indicative and successful process that you go through is the one that matches most closely to what happens in the live. If you catch the things in pre-prod before they go live, then that is what it's all about. And of course, we couldn't go through a QA talk without referring to the dilemma, the conundrum of manual versus auto. So what does that mean in the hiring sphere? Well, there are techniques, there are styles of manual testing. So that's mainly face-to-face. It's either entirely unscripted, unprepared, or very loosely scripted, so not very detailed. It's about probing, making provocative questions to get interesting answers. And it's more about personality. It's about one-to-one relations, or in a panel case, many-to-one. It's what you might describe as exploratory testing. The automation sphere is more about stats, collecting stats, giving tests and making scores, making certifications, qualifications mandatory. And this is more suitable to what I'd call regression testing. This is more about if a person's just left, you want to basically replace the same person. So you want to ensure that if that person had this qualification and scored this on a psychometric test, then you just want the same person back. And that's more often the case in corporations, obviously larger companies. And then you've got the hybrid approach, which is what I personally kind of prefer, which is what I would classify as researched face value. So obviously, when you go through the hiring process, you have to take everything on face value. To go back on to that example I gave earlier of the person who sweated a lot, it's totally the case that that person might have been really good at the job, but I had to take what was presented to me on the day as face value. And I gave that person the same chance as everybody else, or gave them the same time as everybody else. So if the result ended up not being what was expected, then you have to kind of take it as it is, but with some kind of research. So read the CV, understand the profile of the person, understand as much as you can in advance. It's what you might call static testing plus runtime. And obviously that depends on whether you've got a very formal or informal approach, whether you have to sign off lots of things, whether you have to tick a lot of boxes for HR, or you have absolutely no structure at all and you can hire anyone. So why again, you could ask, so what? Well, the point of looking at it this way is actually that often matches the organization. So if the hiring process is highly automated, then it's probably the case that the organization is highly automated as well, and the culture there is such. And the same at the other end of the continuum. So if it's a highly manual process, then it's very likely that the organization also matches that. So that's often the case, but almost always the case is that it matches the management style. So how you go through the process, if the person hiring is going to be your manager, then it's very often the case that however that process goes is what's going to happen once you actually get the job. And the same for the candidate side. Not always, but as a generalization, it generally does match. And obviously the closer you can get that to matching the live circumstance, the better it is for everyone. The other thing that I wanted to look at is, to mention is context. So you should always look at things at the bigger picture to try and understand what the context is. People often look at themselves, am I good at this job kind of idea, or are we a great organization? They tend to look at things in a vacuum, what you might call a unit test. Am I really good? Yeah, I'm really good. But the point is, you can only guess what else is going on around when you go for these, when you go to test these things for real. So, for example, you have no idea about the interviewer status. Maybe that person got the job today. Maybe they actually started working there today, and you're the first person they've ever interviewed. The company might be heavily invested in QA, and you might be the first person that they've ever hired, or you might be the 100th, and they're expecting the 100th to be exactly the same as the 99th. There's a diversity issue in the sense of maybe that the organizations decided that they want to rebalance diversity and they want you to be a particular profile. Whether that happens to be you or the opposite case, that's down to, as again, flip of a coin kind of luck. And then there's also timing. Time makes a big difference. So I've got quite a bizarre tale of, I went for an interview and they had on the job spec that you needed a year's experience in the particular thing they wanted. And I had 10 months. So we went through the entire process, and which was the recruiter screening, then the phone interview, and then face-to-face interview, which was quite a heavy 3-hour grilling. It was actually one of the toughest interviews I've ever been through. And I got the feedback that, well, if I come back in 2 months, I'll have enough experience to meet the expectation that I should have a year's experience in that particular thing. Quite a bizarre kind of idea, but it seems like it does happen in the real world. And so you should always think about whether, if you apply today or in a year, or when you were a teenager or when you're a pensioner, does it actually matter? And it probably does. These are the things that I'd call the hidden picture. They're the things that are going on in the context of the hiring process that you've got no idea about and you've got no control over. So it's not that I'm suggesting that you get obsessed by these things, but it's actually the opposite case, that you actually don't take them so seriously. If you get rejected for a role, it may be for any one of a number of reasons which actually have nothing to do with you. Then there's the bigger picture. There are the things that you might know about and also affect the outcome. So there's third parties. Maybe there's an HR department who are heavily involved in what's going on, and they review everything, and that you may get rejected from them and not from the actual hiring manager. Again, you shouldn't take that so seriously or personal, because it just happens to be that's the setup of that particular place. There's also the market, whether there's lots of jobs going around, whether it's obviously competitive, whether it's high competition, low competition. It depends on, going back to the idea of timing. And then there are trends. Maybe it's really fashionable to have your skills at the moment, or maybe not. And that obviously has an effect on the outcome too. So I'd just like to finish off by saying that, although I'm saying that the hiring process and the software testing process are similar, you have to think that the hiring process is actually not simple. So if you take what I've said today, it's actually simultaneous two-way testing. As a candidate, you're testing the company, and the company at the same time is testing you. And obviously, if you've got simultaneous testing going on, that's what a friend of mine likes to call 3D chess. That's multiple strategies going on at once in different directions that you need to think about simultaneously. Also, it means there's a lot of simultaneous empathetic thinking and emotional intelligence going on, or in some cases, the total lack of it. And again, it's not something to get obsessed over, but it's just something to think about, that there are lots of things going on, and the complexity of the things shouldn't be that you just walk up and say, well, let's see how it goes. There's also third parties, there's recruiters, there's consultants, there's HR, there's management. And in the end, it's all about people, and people are really complicated and highly unpredictable. So that's it. So to recap, I think there's a really strong similarity between the testing and the hiring process. It's full of risk on all sides, but I believe the false positives are the worst outcome. You should always plan, review, analyze, and the important thing is matching between the expected and actual. You should try to zoom out as much as you can and look at the end-to-end process and try to be less personal about it. What you might call a 4D approach to hiring. In doing so, you'll take out a bit of the emotion, a bit more of the kind of personal evaluation, and by doing so, you'll put in more techniques and focus more on the success criteria. Always think like a user, an interviewer or interviewee, or anybody else who might be involved. It'll help to take yourself out of the process, in the sense of being subjective, and it'll help you be more objective. It'll also enable you to harness your existing skills. If you're good at testing, then you're probably good at hiring and getting a job. And you should use cross-training to improve that. And you should always project deserved confidence, because confidence is what it's all about. So that's it. And if any of you have examples that I could enrich this idea with, or if you take this approach and go and get a job, then I'd love to hear your stories. So that's it. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm ready for any comments or questions if you've got any.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for that, Alan. brilliant talk. I think there should be a lot of similarities that people may not have known between the two through that as well. If anyone's got any questions, if you can just pop them in the Zoom chat at the bottom of your screen, and then we can run through those as they come through. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. If you can just go onto the Zoom chat and put in any questions you might have. Okay, does no one have any questions at all?
That's fair enough. Maybe it was all obvious,
Okay.
maybe it was all rubbish.
Okay, there's a couple come through. So, what is the salary you are looking for? How can we answer?
You mean if somebody asks?
Yeah, I
salary,
said just yeah. If that question's brought up, how would you go about answering that?
Again, I think it should be based on some kind of research and not be thought up on the spot. It's the kind of thing you should think about in advance. So if you know what you would consider acceptable and you know what the market rate is, then you should just go ahead and well, actually you should avoid giving a particular number unless you're really pressed, because I think that's part of a whole negotiation kind of process, which should probably be done towards more of the end if everything else works out. But if you're really pushed into a corner and you need to answer, then I think you should say whatever you feel like you think is the right number for you, for expectations and what the market says. So
yeah, I think it's a difficult one. Like you said, there's a number of variables, and like you say, it should be something that probably is at the end where there's a bit of negotiation maybe to go onto as well. So let's go through. We've got a couple more here. So how would you answer the question, tell us about yourself?
I think, again, you should have this well prepared. It should be something that you should expect to answer every time you go to an interview. And so you should have a nice little paragraph that you go through. Normally, what do people care about? They don't want to hear about your hobbies necessarily or what you've been doing for the last 20 years. What they want to know is what your most recent kind of role is, what you're doing at the moment, and then overall how you'd summarize what you're all about, what your achievements are, what your expectations are. So I think it depends on the person, but you should generally, I think what people are looking for when they ask that question is whether you've got the ability to express yourself in a coherent way and concisely, so that you don't spend a long time on it. I would just say half a minute of what would be basically whatever matches your summary profile on your CV.
Perfect. And do you think there is value in practical interview tests?
I personally don't use them, and I have had a situation where I've needed to use them because that was the policy of the company at the time. But I often think that it's difficult to get some value out of them unless they're really well designed and you really know what the answers you're looking for are going to be. I would rather do that as part of the interview process myself than to delegate it to a test. But as I said to you, lots of companies, they have this concept of automated testing, automated hiring. And so if you need a score for that, then obviously you if that's the policy, then you need to do that. But as a general rule, I wouldn't use them.
Okay, perfect. If you are to choose between two individuals, one with great technical skills but communication that is not that good, and one with great personal skills who is willing to learn the skills on the job, which would you hire?
That's a good question. Again, the answer to that depends on your original spec, your original expectations. If you want someone to come in and be an excellent communicator and you really value that skill, then you'd put that one above. If you have a team of excellent communicators and the one element you're missing is somebody technical, then obviously choose the other. So I know that sounds a bit of a fudgy answer, but actually it's true that it really does depend on the context.
Yep, perfect. And what's your advice for somebody who hasn't interviewed for a very long time?
Got to practice. It goes back to what I said earlier, that don't let the first interview that you go through in 10 years be the one for your perfect job. You really need to go through it beforehand. Either practice it in front of the mirror or record yourself, because obviously there's lots of tools where you can do that now. But the best thing is to go to someone who does interview for a living or has experience doing so and practice with them, whether that be in the current company or whether that is somebody you might know or a contact. I'd be happy to give mock interviews to people if they'd find that useful.
Okay, excellent. And what do you think will be the expectation for a candidate who has 13 years experience as an interviewer?
Where the candidate has interview experience, yes.
Reading it, yes.
Yeah,
so what would your expectations as an interviewer be, interviewing a candidate with 13 years experience? What should that candidate do to capture the moment? So I guess what should they do to stand out?
To stand out above to basically to use the interviewer skills to stand out as an interviewee. Yeah, I see. So I think somebody with that kind of experience ought to be really, really good at the empathetic thinking that I was referring to earlier, and that you should be able to use that skill to absolutely adjust to the person who's interviewing and treat them more like a peer than more than being passive to the process, so that I would be a lot more personal. If the interviewer understands that you get what it is to be an interviewer, I would absolutely use that to the maximum, and it will give them the impression and remember you more if you show that actually you're not fazed by interviewing at all, and you can do it yourself, and so you can totally get where they're coming from. People always respond more positively to those who they have more in common with, and so that's a perfect opportunity for you to show how much in common you are.
Okay, perfect. I recently read that most people have secured their test roles through their network rather than through a job ad. Any tips for applying cold stroke directly to adverts for a position?
I think that very much depends on a person's situation. I mean, I personally, maybe that's just because of the network I have or don't have, but I've actually only ever got jobs through interviewing. And I've only, apart from a couple of exceptions, I've always hired people through the interview process. So that's not my experience, but there's nothing wrong with cold calling to approach someone. They may even see that as a benefit. Again, it goes back to the idea of it depends on the organization. If they are much more open-minded and more flexible and less rigid about what they do, then they get a request from someone who can do the role that they're looking for, then I think they jump at the chance. So I think just be straightforward. Say that why you're looking, why you want to join that company, and it goes back to the same thing earlier. Tell me about yourself. Give a short paragraph about yourself, and just go for it. I wouldn't hold back. There's nothing to be lost. Going back to the risk idea, what's the risk? There isn't actually any that I can see, apart from you spend a few minutes on writing an email. So I'd definitely go for it.
Okay, perfect. Just looking at the time, I think we've got time for one more question. So as an interviewee, which testing technique can I refer to find out the team stroke project I'm being interviewed for is high performing stroke skilled stroke productive team? What questions would help me to fetch that information?
That's a really good question. So what you'd be in effect looking for is ways to indicate whether a team is productive. I think you should use the method that I referred to earlier as exploratory. So ask provocative questions, ask questions that are totally unexpected, and see what responses you get, and then try to ask the same question but in a different way and see if there's consistency, because it will give you an indication of whether they're saying what they think they're supposed to say or whether they're more telling the truth. That's also an interviewer technique that, you know, it's a way of trying to see whether it's basically what you might call a lie detection technique. I would try that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much again, Alan, for obviously the presentation and for answering those questions. Really, really insightful, and I guess again, it's good just to see the correlation between the two. I hope that helps out a lot of people on the call going forwards. We'll also get this shared over the next couple of days on social media as well, so you can pass it out to your network and look back again for any further reference. Any other questions that people may have, feel free to reach out to me directly or to Alan himself, and between us we'll be able to get back to you and answer those. But no, thank you everyone for joining us, and I'll speak to you soon.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks for the forum. Thanks, bye.